On April 5th, a girl named Samantha Granger went missing in the town of Daggerlin. If you're from Ohio, you might know this place, but probably not. Daggerlin is about 60 miles east of Cleveland, and it's so small you could easily miss it. Take Highway I-90, go past Euclid and Mentor, and keep driving. Most maps don't show it anymore, and there might be a good reason for that. It's hard to find any history about this place. I've tried looking up different stories myself but didn't find much. Old newspaper stories go back over 100 years. I've heard everything from the town being part of an old shipping road that got blocked up and was left behind, to farmland that went broke during the Dust Bowl. There's talk of a fire near the water in 1908, it burned through some old boathouses and killed a few men. After that, there aren't many records left. It's the kind of place where each new group of people seems to hide the secrets of the ones who came before. Until all that's left is fog and stories. All I know is our story starts with little Samantha Granger. Spring in Ohio is wet, especially near Lake Erie, but the first week of April was surprisingly sunny. There were no clouds, no rain, and the town seemed happier than usual. Winter that year had been really gloomy. If you've lived around snow, you'll understand the difference between the pretty fluffy white kind and the quarter-inch of ugly mud that seems to cover everything and gets on your boots. When April came, it surprised everyone, especially the kids who had felt trapped inside for what seemed like forever. That morning, the air was clear and the lake looked calm, very calm, like someone had pressed pause on the water itself. Birds were out. Flags hung still. It was the kind of morning that made people open their windows just to let the smell of thawed dirt drift in. A fresh, clean start. Samantha Granger was 8 years old. A quiet kid. She liked puzzles and purple shoes and collecting smooth stones from the beach. She lived 2 blocks from the water, and when her mother turned around to grab her coffee that morning, Samantha was already gone, coat half-zipped, running down the sidewalk like the world had finally opened back up. They say she must have gone to the water. The footprints stopped near the edge of the cliff, and her scarf was found caught in a thorn bush just off the trail. But the beach itself? Empty. No body. No marks where something was dragged. No sign of a fight. That's what makes Samantha different. The others had signs. Broken glass. Torn clothes. But Samantha. She just disappeared. Like the lake opened its arms and took her. Anything? George asked. The bathroom door opened slowly. Laura stepped out in her robe, eyes looking down. She didn't say a word, just shook her head once. George opened his arms, but she pulled away. He reached out anyway, pulled her close, and held her without speaking, one hand on her lower back, the other holding the back of her head. "It's okay," he said quietly. They'd been trying for over a year. Every month, hope would flicker. Every month, it went out. "You're still young," the doctors had said. "It happens when it happens." But nothing was happening. Just silence and the slow pain of time. And 37 wasn't all that young for having children. "I'm fine," Laura said, pulling away. "I know," George replied, but she didn't hear. She was already halfway down the stairs. For a moment George stared out the upstairs window thinking, and then the radio interrupted him. It crackled, then made a hissing sound. "Sheriff Lost, you there?" Mendez's voice came through, calm, but quick. George blinked, looked away from the window. He stepped over to the dresser, pressed the button on the radio. "Go ahead. We've got a problem down near the water. Little girl, Samantha Granger. Her mom says she hasn't seen her since this morning." "How long exactly?" "Couple hours. Said she turned around to grab coffee, and the kid was just gone. She's worried she ran down to the beach, apparently the girl loves it there." George was already moving, buttoning his shirt, grabbing his belt off the hook. "I'll be there in 10, he said. The weather held, even down by the lake, bright sky, soft sun, the kind of early spring day people in Daggerlin prayed for after a harsh winter. But as Sheriff George Lost stepped out of his police car, he felt it change slightly. The wind wasn't strong, but at the water's edge, it picked up just enough to carry the smell of salt and wet weeds. He walked down the familiar dirt path, boots pressing into thawed ground. Mendez stood waiting just past the cliff, near the rocks that looked out over the water. She gave him a small nod. "Where's the mom?" George asked. "Up at the house. Deputies with her. Says Samantha took off a little after 8. Said she always loved the beach after it rained," Mendez replied. George looked down at the sand. "You see her yet?" Mendez pointed toward a narrow drop-off. "Come look." He followed her down to the beach. It was quiet, not dead quiet, just still, like everything was paused mid-breath. A seagull flew overhead. The lake was calm. "There," Mendez said. She pointed. In the wet sand, you could see them, small footprints, pressed clearly, heading toward the water. George crouched beside them, following the trail with his eyes. They stopped maybe 6 feet from the edge of the water. No return prints. No sign of panic. Just gone. Something purple caught his eye. Caught in a thorn bush just off the trail, moving slightly in the breeze, was a child's scarf. He stared out at the water for a long moment. The sun sparkled off the surface. It looked harmless, even pretty. But something about the stillness bothered him. "Call in drones, dogs, all of it," he said. Mendez paused. "You think she drowned?" "I don't think anything yet." But he did. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud. 2 days later, the town gathered at Holloway Park. No one made announcements. No flyers. Just a quiet understanding that they'd meet at the gazebo by sunset. The air was still mild for April, low 50s, no rain, the last of the light fading behind the trees. George arrived just after 7. He parked along the edge of the lot and walked the rest of the way in, keeping to himself. People were already there, maybe 30, maybe more, scattered in small groups, each holding a candle. At the front, someone had taped up Samantha's school photo. It moved slightly in the breeze, the tape on the corners barely holding. A mason jar of purple flowers had been set beneath it. A few stuffed animals. Nothing fancy. Just small, quiet things. Her mother stood near the post. Alone, wrapped in a heavy coat, hands at her sides. She didn't speak. Didn't cry. Just stared at the picture like she was waiting for it to change. A few people began to hum. Not a song George recognized, just a low, uncertain harmony, like they couldn't agree on what comfort sounded like. He held his candle, watched the flame waver slightly with the wind coming off the lake. The crowd didn't move. No one sat. No one spoke. They just stood there in the quiet, surrounded by cold and flickering light. Somewhere behind him, a child coughed. One candle went out. Then another. George looked up. The wind had shifted. "Sheriff to base, come in. We've got a code 847, repeat, code 847. Suspect is, very suspicious." George paused in the doorway, coffee in hand, and just watched. 9-year-old Owen Winters sat behind his desk, legs swinging, eyes squinting seriously as he leaned into the radio mic like it was life or death. His backpack was still on, one strap slipping down his shoulder, and Crichton, a thin black German shepherd, was curled up at his feet like a shadow with ears. He followed Owen everywhere. "You know we don't actually have a code 847, right?" George said. Owen turned, grinning. "Then you should." George sipped his coffee. "And what exactly does it mean?" Owen looked thoughtful. "Don't know. But dangerous." Crichton let out a low, lazy huff, thumping his tail once against the floor. George stepped fully into the room, setting his mug down on the edge of the desk. "You break into my station again." "Didn't break in," Owen said. "Door was open." "I'll have to talk to my staff about that," George replied. "I left Crichton outside at first, just in case," Owen added, like that earned him points. "But he gets sad when I get too far." Crichton stretched his front paws forward and made a noise that sounded like agreement. George pulled a chair over and sat. "Where's your dad?" "Hardware store," Owen said. "I told him I wanted to come here instead. It's really close, so he said okay." George gave a small nod. He glanced at the stack of files on the corner of his desk but didn't reach for them. Owen leaned back, feet still swinging. It's kind of quiet around town. George looked at him. Quiet how? Owen shrugged. People just act weird. Nobody says anything, but they're looking around a lot. George raised an eyebrow. You always notice things this much? Owen thought about it. Notice things. Crichton huffed again, ears moving slightly. It means you see things, George said. Owen grinned. I see lots of things, yeah. Maybe I'll put you on payroll, George replied, but until then get out of my desk. Owen smiled and slid out of the chair without a word. Crichton followed him, tail swishing low. The front door creaked open a few seconds later. There you are, David Winters said, stepping in. Told you to stay close. Owen pointed a thumb at George. He let me in. David gave George a look. That true, Sheriff? Sheriff George Lost shrugged. David sighed, shook his head. You bothering him? Owen shook his head. You eat yet? Another shake. Go let Crichton out for a minute, David said. And don't throw anything. Owen gave a quick nod, grabbed the leash from the wall, and led the dog outside. The door shut behind them. David watched for a moment, then turned back toward George. His voice dropped. She was in his class. Samantha. George nodded once. He hasn't said much, David added. Not about her. Not about any of it. He's young, George said. Yeah, David began. Still feels like he knows more than he lets on. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, through the front window, they could see Owen walking the dog and staying close. You think we'll find her? David asked. George didn't answer right away, and then finally said, I don't know. David leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed. Feels like the kind of thing we should know. George didn't respond. Outside, Owen jogged a little ahead of Crichton, holding the leash loosely. The dog didn't seem to mind, just stayed at his side, ears up, watching everything. You ever think, David said after a minute, that maybe we were better off not knowing what was out there? Like, back when we were kids. You just assumed someone would handle it. George glanced at him. We are the someone. Yeah, David muttered. That's the problem. The station creaked faintly, one of those sounds old buildings make when they settle, or remember. George stared at the window a while longer, watching Owen crouch down to tie his shoe and Crichton nose at something in the grass. He doesn't ask about her, David said quietly. Not directly. But he knows. He knows she's gone. George nodded once. I don't know how to talk to him about that, David admitted. You'd think after losing Claire I'd be better at this stuff, but... He cut himself off. George waited, but nothing else came. Claire had been his friend too, they'd all been a group once. David hadn't said her name in a long time, and it was good to hear it again. She had died, but she wasn't gone. David gave a small smile, the first one since he walked in. The moment held, quiet, heavy, and just before it could settle fully, the radio crackled on the desk. Sheriff Lost, you copy? George stepped forward and picked it up. Go ahead. It's Mendez, came the voice. We've got another one. 8-year-old boy, Josh Maddox. Parents said he was riding his bike near the lake at Palmer's Bluff. That was about 40 minutes ago. No sign of him since. George's grip tightened on the receiver. Is there a search party yet? Already started. Found the bike tipped over. That's it, Mendez replied. He set the radio down. David was already on his feet. You want company? George looked at him. You sure? David gave a short nod. Owen's grandpa's 2 stores over. I'll flag him on the way out, have him take the kid home. George didn't argue. The door shut behind them. Sheriff Lost stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the wind catching the edge of his jacket. David followed close behind, both men walking with purpose toward the police car. As George slid into the driver's seat, he keyed the mic on the dashboard. Mendez, it's Sheriff Lost. We're coming now. We'll be there in 6 minutes. Copy that, Sheriff, came the reply. I've got 2 deputies looking around the bluff, but no sign of the kid yet. David buckled his seatbelt. Josh Maddox. That's one of Owen's classmates. George nodded. I remember the name from the school visits. They pulled out onto the main road, lights flashing but no siren. Dagalon wasn't big enough to need one, everyone moved over when they saw the police car anyway. Palmer's Bluff was just north of the main beach, a rocky outcrop that stuck into the lake like a bent finger. It wasn't far, a 10-minute ride on a normal day, shorter if you pushed the limit. David watched the side streets as they passed, his fingers drumming against his leg. You think it's the same thing? He asked. George didn't answer right away. The truth was, he did, deep down, in that part of his gut that only ever spoke when something was really wrong. But saying it out loud made it too real. We'll see when we get there, he said instead. As they turned off the main road, the trees thinned and the lake came into view, wide, flat, and still gleaming under the late sun. A few figures moved near the edge of the bluff, one of them raising a hand as they approached. George parked near the old split-rail fence and stepped out. Mendez met them halfway, hair tied back, clipboard tucked under one arm. Parents said he was riding along the trail. They lost sight of him for just a minute, she said. Deputies found the bike, but no sign of Josh. Where's the bike? George asked. Down near where the path splits. Come on. They followed Mendez through the brush, boots crunching softly on gravel and leaves. The trail sloped downward, turning toward a low clearing where the path forked. There, laying on its side just off the trail, was a small red bike. No scrapes. No skid marks. Just lying there like the boy had stepped off and wandered into the woods. George crouched beside it, fingers brushing the handlebars. No sign of a fight. Nothing obvious, Mendez began. Just this, and his backpack about 10 feet that way. George stood, squinting toward the waterline. The wind was stronger now, not rough, but steady. It carried the faint smell of algae and driftwood, something sour underneath. He turned to David. Let's split up. You take the bluff. I'll check the trail past the bend. David nodded and headed up the slope without a word, moving quick. George lingered. There was something off here. Something quiet in the way the birds weren't singing. Something about how the bike just sat there. Then he saw it. Near the edge of the clearing. A line of small footprints, half faded, pressed into the wet ground, heading toward the trees, and then nothing. Just the lake. George crouched, looking at the shoreline. The mud near the edge was dark and slick, but no obvious drag marks cut across it. He moved slowly, eyes adjusting to the glare of the late-day sun on the water. Josh, he called, keeping his voice steady. It's Sheriff Lost. You out here? No answer. George followed the line of footprints again. They stopped barely 2 feet from where the tall grass began. Something about the way they ended bothered him, no stumble, no shift in weight, no turn back toward the trail. Just gone. He straightened and looked out over the lake. The water was calm, but a faint ripple moved against the wind near the edge. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, like something had disturbed the surface and then slipped under. A branch cracked somewhere in the brush to his right. George turned, hand hovering near his gun. Josh. A small figure stepped out. Mud streaked the boy's cheeks, and his hair stuck up in clumps. He clutched something against his chest, a worn backpack, zipper half open. Hey, George said softly, keeping his distance. You okay? Josh didn't answer. His eyes darted past George, toward the water. Footsteps pounded down the slope. David appeared at George's shoulder, breathing hard. Relief crossed his face when he saw the boy. Josh. Your mom's looking all over for you. The kid didn't move. His lips opened slightly, and for a second George thought he might say something, but then the ripple on the lake grew. It started maybe 20 feet out, pushing toward shore. Sunlight caught on something dark just beneath the surface. The movement was smooth, on purpose, not the random splash of a current. As it came closer, the water got shallow enough for a shape to break through. The head came first, sleek, black, wet, followed by shoulders that rolled strangely as they rose. Long arms ended in claws that scraped at the sand. And the mouth, it was full of sharp teeth, curled into something like a grin. David looked over and spoke first. "What the hell is that?" Josh took a step back. David moved in front of him, one hand out to push him farther from the water. George stayed rooted, eyes locked on the thing as it stepped from the shallow water. Each claw dug into the wet ground. It didn't rush. It didn't show off. It just kept walking, slow and sure, that grin never leaving its face. "A sheriff," David said. But George didn't answer. His hand was already on his holster, thumb flicking the strap free. The creature stepped closer. The wet slosh of its feet against the sand was louder than it should have been. 2 more slow steps, claws sinking into the mud. Another step. The waterline was behind it now. George fired a warning shot, but the thing kept moving closer. Then another shot. A puff of mist and black water kicked up from the creature's shoulder, but it didn't flinch. George fired again, center mass. This time he saw the round hit, a small burst just under its collarbone. The creature staggered, just a little, but its grin stayed fixed. Another step. "George," David muttered. Another shot rang out. The round hit dead in the chest, right where a man's heart would be. The creature looked down for a moment, then back up. George took a half step backward, boots crunching in the sand. He'd seen men get shot and keep moving before, adrenaline, bad drugs, worse luck. But this was different. There was no pain in those eyes. No fear. The thing lifted one long claw and tapped the spot where the bullet had hit. Josh whimpered behind David. "Get him out of here," George said without looking away. David's hand tightened. George adjusted his stance, bringing the pistol back up. The creature watched them go, then turned its attention fully to him. That grin stayed fixed, water dripping steadily from its chin and the ragged tips of its claws. It took a step closer. George fired once, a clean, center mass shot. The round hit with a wet thump, kicking up a spray of dark fluid. The thing staggered but only for a heartbeat before straightening again. Another step. George fired again. The bullet punched into its side. No reaction. George backed up 2 steps, keeping his sights locked. His boots found firmer ground near the grass line, and he planted himself there. He wasn't giving it the beach. 20 feet out. 15. The grin widened until it seemed to split its face. It tapped one long claw against the hole in its chest, smearing the dark fluid there, and then let out a slow breath. 10 feet. George's finger tightened on the trigger. The creature's grin didn't falter. Its claws flexed slightly, dragging lines in the wet sand. It was close now. And then from behind, muffled at first, came voices, men and women calling through the trees. Footsteps crunching on the brush. The unmistakable sound of more than one person moving quick. "Sheriff Mendez. Over here." George barked, eyes still locked on the thing. The creature's gaze shifted, not toward the sound, but back to him, like the rest of the world didn't exist. The voices grew louder. Branches snapped. Boots hit the sand somewhere behind him. George blinked once. He turned his head to call again, and when he looked back, the shoreline was empty. No ripple on the water. No churned mud where it had stood. Just calm lake and the faint imprint of claws in the sand, already filling with dark water that seeped in from the tide. He held his gun up a second longer, scanning the surface for any break, any shadow. Nothing. Mendez was the first down the slope, her boots skidding slightly in the wet sand. She stopped a few feet from him, chest rising and falling. "What happened?" she asked, eyes scanning the lake. George kept his gaze fixed on the water. It was here. What was? The rest of the deputies were spilling onto the beach now, their flashlights already cutting over the sand and reeds. None of them looked toward the water like they expected to see anything. "I don't see anything," Mendez said, stepping closer. "Was it the kid?" George shook his head once. "Not the kid." She followed his stare out to the lake. "Then what?" George finally looked at her, the weight in his expression making her pause. Mendez glanced back at the calm water, then to the wet claw marks near his feet. She crouched, touching the edge of one with her fingers. These weren't here earlier. No, George said. They weren't. The wind shifted, colder now, carrying the faint smell of the lake up around them. Somewhere in the trees, someone called that they'd found David and Josh. George stared out at the water. Let's get everyone off the beach. The meeting hall on Main Street wasn't built for crowds, but by 6 o'clock the following night, every folding chair was taken. A few people stood in the back, arms crossed, murmuring under their breath. The overhead lights gave everything a faint yellow cast, and the smell of coffee from the refreshment table hung in the air. George stood near the front, leaning on the podium like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mendez was off to his left, talking quietly with two deputies. David sat in the second row, Owen at home with his grandfather. All right, George began, his voice carrying enough to quiet the room. Thanks for coming on short notice. I know folks have things to do, but this is important. A man in the back raised a hand. This about Samantha? George's jaw tightened. It's about her, and it's about Josh Maddox. That got the room talking again, a ripple of voices, quick and tense. George waited for it to die down. I'm going to be straight with you, he said. 2 kids have gone missing near the lake in the last 3 days. One is still missing. One was found today, alive. For now, that's all I'm going to say about details. A woman in the third row frowned. You mean the lake's not safe? George looked around the room, meeting eyes where he could. I mean this, starting immediately, I'm asking everyone to stay away from the water. No fishing, no walking the shore, no late-night boating. Keep your kids away from the cliffs and the waterline, day or night. If you see anything unusual, I don't care if it's a person, an animal, anything, you call my office right away. Don't check it out yourself. The room fell quiet, but the unease was obvious. From tonight on, there's a curfew at 8 p.m. If you have to be out past that, you call my office and we'll send someone to help you. This is just until we've got a better handle on things. An older man in a work coat stood up. George, we've lived here all our lives. You telling us we're not safe in our own town? I'm telling you to use your head, Jim, George said. Until we know what's going on, we need to be safe. No one moved to argue. A few nodded reluctantly. That's all, George said. When the meeting broke, most people filed out quickly, conversations kept to low murmurs. George stayed at the front, watching them go, until only a handful remained, David, Mendez, and 2 deputies. Mendez stepped closer. You think they'll listen? I don't know, George replied. Mendez pulled a chair closer to the podium and sat, resting her forearms on her knees. All right, she said. What happened out there today? You've been dancing around it since I called you. George didn't answer right away. He walked to the refreshment table, poured himself a coffee that had been sitting too long, and took a slow sip. You wouldn't believe me. Try me, Mendez said. David was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his expression tight. I saw it too. That made Mendez pause. So what? George finally turned toward them. There was something in the water. Tall. It had claws. Mendez tilted her head. An animal? No, George said. It was standing upright. I think it was smiling. David's eyes flicked to the floor. George fired. Hit it once in the chest. Didn't slow it down. Mendez's mouth worked for a second before any words came out. And you're sure you weren't seeing things? No, George said. It was there, and it was real. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Mendez rubbed at the bridge of her nose. So what's the plan? I don't know yet, but for now we keep people away from the lake, George said. And we stay ready. David pushed off the wall. If it comes back, I'm not waiting for it to make the first move. George met his eyes, and for a moment the sheriff's tired expression hardened into something else. He thought of Josh. He had taken the little boy home after what happened, and he was safe. But George thought of what might have happened if they'd been just 1 minute later. He shuddered. Outside, the night settled over Daggerland like a heavy blanket. The town hall had emptied out, leaving just the hum of old lights and the distant hush of the lake beyond. George took a breath, feeling the weight of the evening settle on his shoulders. They filed out quietly, leaving George alone in the stillness. For a moment, he just listened, to the faint creak of the old building, to the distant lap of water against the shore. He reached for his hat from the table, settling it low on his brow. His hand lingered there for a second before he stepped out into the cool night air. The street was empty, the kind of stillness that felt earned after a long day. Porch lights dotted the block, and somewhere far off a screen door clapped shut. Then it came, a sound drifting from the direction of Lake Erie. Low at first, almost like the wind catching in a hollow log, then rising into something else. It didn't belong to any bird or animal George had ever heard, and it carried too far across the water to be an accident. He stood there, listening until the sound died out, leaving only the faint lap of water against the shore. He'd told Laura to stay at her mother's in Youngstown, a bit of a drive, but at least it was inland. As for him, he'd be staying. It was his responsibility to watch over the town of Daggerland. George stepped back inside, checked the load in his revolver, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. It was gonna be a long night.